Good afternoon. Good afternoon. So I have a little liveliness here. Um, I'm going to be the exception in two ways. First, I don't have PowerPoint. I'm sorry. It's just my little protest against packaging. But more seriously, I'm the novice here. And I feel very privileged to have this opportunity to learn from my colleagues about the work that they've been doing over the years and the world that they've been working in. My engagement with these worlds really only goes back about 2.5 years to a workshop at Pedagogy at Peking University with 64 NGO leaders, sponsored by the Sun Culture Foundation, which I have to say was an extraordinary experience. And I think that experience then, I think I brought back with me when I talked with Dr. Perry and others about it, that sort of it was an opening up of my eyes in some important ways. Since then, I've worked for 2 years with the SEED group. Rishi, your group over there. Would you introduce your group, please?
And I'm Rishi.
And
Yeah, you mean introduce the organization now?
just say a word about it.
Okay, yeah. So Harvard City is a registered student organization under GSES. Our full name is Harvard Seed Citizenship and Social Innovation. The reason we call it SEED is it represents our core value, which is social responsibility, empathy, empowerment, and dedication. We hope to promote social sector development in China through developing young leaders and young future leaders, especially in social sector. And by promoting innovation, especially in social innovation, and by building this very supportive and inspiring community of young leaders to through programs held both in Harvard and in Tsinghua University, trying to bring in new ideas of civil society and best practices in social innovation, and also on the ground of China. That's why we're also working with Tsinghua to work on the practices of China and learn. So the core is we would recruit 30 fellows, seed fellows from abroad China and domestic, to select them from all diverse background. So now our purpose is to develop these young leaders. Okay. In the future, we hope to bring changes on the community level that will promote civic engagement on the ground of China, to build and rebuild and improve their own community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So my first data point was the workshop at Beida with sponsored by Sun Culture of 64 NGO leaders that we worked with for 4 days. Second data point is the work with SEED, 2 years, 30 students from China. And the third was last December in Tokyo. We worked to launch they're calling themselves now Community Organizing Japan, and which was with about 50 NGO leaders from across Japan who were interested in this kind of development. So, but that's it. So when Liz said about sharing impressions, that's what I'll share, is impressions. What I thought I would do is say a little bit about what this workshop that I've been involved with, what the content is, how it played out in these different settings, and then some reflections on the experience of it. My background has been in social movements and community organizing and political organization. And so my teaching centers around a pedagogy of practice, really. And it's a practice of, we can describe it as civic leadership. It's an understanding of leadership perhaps a little different than that is normally articulated. It's rooted for me in 3 questions posed by a first century Jerusalem scholar who, when asked, how do we understand what to do in the world, responded with 3 questions. The first one, ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? That there's an element of self-understanding, self-awareness, understanding one's own values, one's own interests and orientation. But the second question he says to ask is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? So that to be a who and not a what is to understand that we exist in relationship with others in the world. And their capacity to realize their objectives inextricably wrapped up with our own. And third question is to ask yourself, if not now, when? That it is rarely without acting that we can really begin to learn what we need to learn to be effective in what we hope to do. So there's an element of courage and an element of risk involved. Now, for me, leadership is about the interaction of those 3 elements of self, other, and action. It's an interactive idea, and it's a way of thinking of leadership as being less about position or person than practice. It sort of challenges the notion that leadership and authority are identical, or that leadership is a function of lovely personality, but that leadership is actually something else, that it's a set of practices. And the other dimension of it is that it inherently is about uncertainty. In other words, that when we least need leadership is when everything's working. It's when things are not working. It's the dilemma, the unexpected, the problematic. That's what creates the need for a response that we can describe as a leadership response. So it's a response to uncertainty, a response to challenge, a response to the unexpected. That means that there's a lot, well, it means, first of all, that there's an element of skill questions. I think of them as hands questions. There's an element of head questions, like, how do I use my resources in new ways to deal with this challenge that I'm facing, a strategic question. And it's a challenge to the heart. It's how do I find the hopefulness, the courage, the capacity to inspire solidarity or faith or trust in order to act into uncertainty. So there's a head, hands, heart dimension to this kind of approach. And the definition that I've come to use is that it's about accepting responsibility, so there's a choice involved in leadership, to enable others, so it's not a diva notion of leadership, about a sun illuminating others, those who come warm. It's about a form of social interaction to achieve purpose, shared purpose, under conditions of uncertainty. And that's how we've been. Now, the third aspect of that is that it is also grounded, given my experience and background, in the question of how change, which is a response to challenge and uncertainty, how do we respond as opposed to react, is often a matter. It's often a matter of how to engage those with the problem or the need for change in the capacity to create change. So in other words, it's less about how those who are fine with the status quo can act from that position than it is from those who are not fine with the status quo can act from their position in order to create the capacity required to be able to realize change that they desire. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. And when I was first invited to do the workshop at Pedagogy, I said, are you sure? I've been an organizer all my life. And is this what we're going to do? Yeah, we're really interested in building social capacity. Huh? Sounded great. Sounded very, very, very interesting. And so we set about this workshop, and where's Serena? Serena, are you here? Yeah. Serena Zhang and Huang Hui, 2 students, Chinese students here, worked with me for about 6 months to train a team of Pedagogy graduate students and undergraduates over the internet every Friday on sort of translating some of this material, and they would become our coaches for the training session when we got there. And then it was a 4-day session with, as I say, 64 leaders of NGOs. Now, the way that I approach this leadership work is, as I said, it's in the form of practices. And so the practices specifically, and I think you'll see why I'm mentioning this, are the building of public relationships. In other words, the foundational work is the construction of relationships around shared values or purpose. Second is the use of what I call public narrative, the use of narrative to translate values into a source of motivated action. How to use narrative to create the emotional conditions for the exercise of agency, to respond as opposed to react. And we teach that in the form of how to tell a story of oneself, a story of one's us, community, and a story of now, the challenge to that community that requires action. Third is strategy, strategizing. That is how to turn resources into how to turn what we have into what we need to get what we want. In other words, how to translate resources into the power to achieve purpose. And finally, action, how to translate strategy into facts on the ground that change. And finally, how to structure all that in a way that facilitates the development and practice of leadership. Now, that last dimension of structure is we challenge the notion of structuring authority as how can I say, supportive of the practice of leadership, constructing authority as like a single alpha that then gives orders to everybody. And actually around the world, we see it really breaking down in many, many different kind of domains, the old command and control model. But we also challenge the notion that's supported by so many market advocates of individuals all pursuing their own interest without any collective structure or capacity. And so we've been focused on collaborative structures, on leadership teams, on distributed leadership, and trying to engage in that as a kind of middle ground between the old and this other new alternative that actually is not much of an alternative, in my perspective, for achieving common purpose. That's sort of the conceptual framework that we're operating with, and quite clear about it. I guess one last thing I'd say about it is that we try to distinguish between organizing and mobilizing. There's a lot of mobilizing going on around the world, turning people out for protests, and then it all recedes 2 days later, or then the Muslim Brothers take over, or then the army. We're thinking of organizing as building the capacity, the infrastructure of leadership structure, strategic capacity, the relationships in order to not just be able to mobilize, but to sustain and benefit from mobilization. So I'm trying to distinguish from protest moments as distinct from actual construction of social infrastructure. Now, the way we approach this is we have a pedagogy that's also rather unusual, which is to explain conceptually, to model whatever it is, then to practice. And so participants in our work are organized in teams with coaches, and they learn, they practice, they get right into the practice of whatever it is in a team context. And then we debrief afterwards. So it's very much of a reflective practice kind of mode of teaching. Now, it really seemed to click at Beda. We did this over 4 days. Each morning there was a presentation of cases of different moments of, I guess I would say, social organization, what's the correct? Social sector organization. No, it was very interesting. Each day there were several cases of different instances in China, whether it was earthquake or whether it was environmental or whatever it was. And then in the afternoon, we would introduce another one of these practices. And we worked then with 8 teams of 8 people. I guess we were fortunate to pick 8. That was kind of a good choice. And each one was coached by one of our coaches, who were often young women, who were actually often younger than the people they were coaching, who were leaders of the various NGOs. And, it took off. What can I say? The projects, the narrative work deeply resonated. The notion that it was okay to speak about one's personal experience in a vulnerable way in a public setting so as to be able to create conditions for trust and solidarity and learning. Once the initial hurdle was over, it was sort of a wellspring of energy and creativity in this. There were other challenges. Constituency, what does that mean? A word constituency that I use in my work here, a community, the Latin constare, to stand together. In other words, an organized community capable of asserting its own voice and being able to act on that assertion. Conceptually challenging. Agency, what are we really mean by that? Very interesting. From my perspective, every time I've worked in a cross-cultural setting, I learn more about my own. The problem of, there's a Yiddish riddle, who invented water? Who discovered water? You may know? The answer is, I don't know, but it wasn't a fish. It's supposed to be funny. No, we all fish in the water of our own context. And so for me, one of the most illuminating experiences is to cross out of that context and have to problematize assumptions that we bring with us. And it produces my own learning, and I hope the learning of those who work with us. Each of these teams developed a project, a potential social development project, based on their values, their interests, where they came from by the end of the program. The one thing that I wish we knew more is what happened since, because we haven't been able to follow up in a way that I would love to have had the opportunity. And maybe we can talk more about how to make that possible. The second setting was with the SEED, 2 years of SEED fellows, who, it's a very similar approach, only they're designing projects they're actually going to do. And they're designing projects for development in China or here in support of. And that's sort of in the form of a 2.5-day workshop. And again, it's coached by people trained from the community that is involved in the learning. Finally, the experience in Japan was initiated by one of my former students named Coco Clamato, who came 2 years ago. The Kennedy School is a great place for an organizer because you don't have to go out, they come to you, it's kind of nice. But Coco was very interested in environmental challenge and had been involved in that, discovered this kind of approach to organizing or social organization, and spent a year apprenticing in New York, and then went back to Tokyo and put together a team that last December recruited 50 NGO leaders from across the country to participate in a 3-day workshop such as I described. And that one was so interesting because it seemed to be a vehicle through which those individuals experienced a sense of community, a sense of usness as NGO leaders that seemed to be new. It seemed to be fresh, and it seemed to be very inspiring to them. The follow-up on that one was that now there is something called community organizing in Japan. They're beginning to work universities, the unions, various civic groups. NHK, the National Television Network, they did a half-hour program on this workshop in which they featured two things, the narrative work and the distributed leadership model, which I thought was really, really interesting, because that's where so much of the energy in these sessions was about narrative as a way to translate and to tap into the resource of values, shared values, in a sort of non-ideological way, I guess I could say. And then the distributed leadership model, which is in many ways a challenge to traditional forms of exercise of authority. So I'm going to conclude right now. What are some of the takeaways for me? First, this whole question of individual and collective agency. What do we mean by that? How does that work? What is it? In Japan, we got into a discussion of it's shutayase. What does that word mean? There's a lot of work around words. We found ourselves trying, what's the right word? What actually, could capture this? Second, as I mentioned, the interest in public narrative was really strong. Partly, I think it's a generational dynamic of people coming out of a traditional setting into a much more cosmopolitan one, confronting the question of, well, who am I and who am I among, and how do I interpret myself to the world? Got it. Third is this whole collaborative leadership as an alternative between individual and individual, whether it's markets or individual as authoritarians. Power as derivative from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. Very interesting and provocative. And so I guess what I'd like to just conclude with is to say, well, maybe it isn't a question of civil society, is it democratic or not, but what kind of civil society? What is it that's actually going on in civil society organizations and associations and entities? What's actually happening at the micro level that interacts with the macro in order to either go one direction or another? I think looking at how authority is managed, how resources are, which resources are relevant, time or money, and where they come from, how work is organized. What are the core values driving people that bring them together? I don't think we can paint it all with one brush. I think we have to look deeply into the differences in the way civil society organizations can be organized. And from that, perhaps we can get a fresh insight into the relationship between the second half and the first half of the question that Dr. Perry began with. Thank you.